The hiss of steam was the only constant, a serpent's breath against the vast, dark silence of the Arizona territory. The train, a black iron caterpillar, chewed its way through a landscape of ghosts, skeletal saguaros reaching for a heaven that seemed to have forgotten them, mesas like sleeping giants under a blanket of stars. Inside the last car, the air was thick with the day's heat clinging to the wood and the bodies pressed within. It smelled of coal smoke, sweat, cheap whiskey, and the fine red dust that was now a part of everything. A film on the glass, a grit between the teeth. Clara felt the dust most of all. It was in her throat, in her lungs, a constant, choking reminder of how far she had run. She sat hunched on the hard wooden bench, making herself as small as a sparrow in a hawk's shadow. Her dress, once a respectable Sunday blue, was torn at the hem and stained with the grime of 3 days' desperate travel. One hand was wrapped so tightly around the drawstring of a small canvas sack in her lap that her knuckles were white and bloodless. The other hand was pressed against her side, clutching the worn fabric of her dress as if it were the only thing holding her together. She had not looked any other passenger in the eye since boarding in Flagstaff. To her, every man was a potential threat, every woman a potential judge. They were a gallery of weary faces illuminated by the unsteady sway of the oil lamps, and a prospector with a beard like tangled weeds, snoring with his mouth agape. A family with 3 small children, their heads lolling in sleep against their mother's worn shoulders. A salesman in a rumpled suit, staring blankly at the dark window. And then, there was him. He sat at the very end of the car, a solitary figure in the corner seat. He had been there when she'd stumbled aboard, and as far as she could tell, he hadn't moved a muscle in the past 100 miles. He was tall, even sitting down, with shoulders that strained the seams of his simple, trail-worn shirt. A dusty brown duster was folded neatly on the seat beside him, and a low-brimmed hat shadowed his face, leaving only a square jaw and the dark stubble of a few days' growth visible in the flickering lamplight. He hadn't spoken a word. He hadn't read a paper or played a hand of cards. He simply watched the desert fly by, his gaze fixed on the darkness as if he could read stories in the shapes of the rocks and the lonely dance of the mesquite. There was a stillness about him that was different from the exhaustion of the other passengers. It wasn't the stillness of fatigue. It was the stillness of a mountain, something ancient and self-contained. He seemed to carry his own silence with him, a shield against the noise and jostle of the world. His name, she'd heard the conductor mutter it once when checking tickets, was Wade Dalton. The name fit him. It was as solid and unadorned as the man himself. For hours, Clara had watched him from the corner of her eye. He was a landmark in the terrifying, shifting landscape of her fear, while every other man's glance felt like a violation. His quiet indifference was a strange sort of comfort. He wasn't looking for anything. He wasn't judging. He simply was. The train whistle shrieked, a mournful cry that cut through the night. The brakes groaned, and the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the wheels slowed to a reluctant crawl. A stop. Not a scheduled one, just a water tower in the middle of nowhere. A knot of ice formed in Clara's stomach. Unscheduled stops were dangerous. They were opportunities. The door at the front of the car slid open with a jarring bang, letting in a gust of cool night air and 3 figures. They were not weary travelers. They were hunters. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. She knew them, not by name, but by the arrogant swagger in their walk, the cruel set of their mouths. They were his men, the men who worked for the man her father had sold her to, the saloon owner, with his fat, ringed fingers and his breath that smelled of stale cigars and rot. The first man, burly and red-faced, scanned the car, his eyes sweeping over the sleeping passengers with open contempt. The second, a wiry man with a long scar down his cheek, smirked, his gaze lingering on the women. The third stayed by the door, a silent enforcer. "Just looking for someone," the red-faced man announced to the car at large, his voice a gravelly boom that woke the children, who began to cry. A slip of a girl, blue dress, brown hair, got something that don't belong to her. Clara sank lower in her seat, trying to will herself invisible. She pulled the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel their eyes moving down the aisle, dissecting each face. It was only a matter of seconds. The car was too small, the light too bright. Her gaze darted around, desperate for an escape that didn't exist. The window, they'd see her. Under the seat, they'd find her. And then her eyes landed on him. Wade Dalton, the still man in the corner. He hadn't turned around. He still faced the window, his posture unchanged, as if the commotion behind him was nothing more than the buzzing of a fly. He was her only chance, a foolish, desperate, impossible chance. Panic overriding her terror of speaking to a stranger, she moved. Her legs were stiff and clumsy, her feet silent on the dusty floorboards. She crept down the aisle, keeping her head low, using the backs of the seats as cover. The men were halfway down the car now, their backs to her. She had maybe 10 seconds. She reached his seat, her shadow falling over him. He must have felt her presence, because his head turned slowly, his eyes finally leaving the desert night. The lamplight caught his face, and for the first time, she saw him clearly. His eyes were the color of a stormy sky, gray and deep, and they held no surprise, only a quiet, unnerving watchfulness. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long miles and hard seasons. He wasn't handsome in the way of city men, but his face had a raw, undeniable strength to it, like a rock formation that had withstood 1,000 years of storms. He didn't speak, he just looked at her, his expression unreadable. Clara's words were a choked whisper, lost in the sound of the children's whimpering and the men's gruff voices. "Please," she breathed, her voice trembling so badly she could barely form the word. "Please, sir, they're looking for me." His gaze flickered past her for a fraction of a second, toward the men, and then back to her face. He saw the raw terror in her eyes, the plea that was deeper than words. He saw the torn dress and the pale, tear-streaked face of a girl who had run out of road. She took a ragged breath. Can I hide?" She gestured vaguely toward his duster beside him. "Under your coat, just for a moment." This was the moment he would say no. He would tell her to move along, that it wasn't his trouble. He would shove her away, back into the path of the hunters. Any sane man would. Why would a stranger risk his life for a girl he didn't know? Wade Dalton didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what she'd done or why they were after her. He didn't ask if she was telling the truth. His stormy eyes held hers for one long, silent beat, and in that silence, a decision was made. Without a word, he shifted his large frame, turning slightly toward the wall of the train. It was a small movement, but it created a space, a pocket of shadow between his body and the corner. Then, with an economy of motion that was almost graceful, he reached over, picked up the heavy canvas duster, and held it open. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was a simple, practical fact. Here is a hiding place. Get in. Tears of gratitude and disbelief stung Clara's eyes. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the small space, curling herself into a tight ball on the wooden bench. The heavy coat fell over her like a shroud, plunging her into a world of darkness. The fabric was thick and smelled of dust, leather, and faintly of the man himself, a clean, masculine scent of sage and open air. It enveloped her, a rough, protective shell. Through a small gap, she could see the lamplight. She heard the heavy tread of the men's boots coming closer. "Check the end of the car," the red-faced man grunted. Clara held her breath, her body rigid with fear. She could feel the warmth from Wade Dalton's body beside her, a solid, unmoving presence. He hadn't flinched. He sat as he had before, a statue of a man looking out at the night, his coat merely draped over what might be a piece of luggage. A pair of muddy boots stopped right beside their seat. "What about him?" the scarred man's voice asked. There was a pause. Clara's world narrowed to the sound of her own frantic pulse. "Nah, leave him," the first man said, his voice filled with dismissal. "He's been sitting there like a rock since sunset. If she was with him, he'd have moved. Let's go check the next car. She's probably hiding in the baggage." The boots moved on. The door at the end of the car slammed shut. The train lurched forward, the engine groaning as it picked up speed, resuming its relentless journey into the dark heart of the territory. The rhythmic clack-clack-clack returned. A comforting heartbeat. Clara stayed perfectly still, huddled in the darkness, listening to the fading sounds of the men's voices. She was safe, for now. Under the coat of a silent stranger, she allowed herself one silent sob of relief. A single tear tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. Wade Dalton did not move. He just kept watch over the desert, a silent guardian in the long, lonely night. The train's rhythm was a fragile lullaby, and for a few precious minutes under the heavy duster, Clara allowed her terror to subside into a numb exhaustion. The warmth from Wade's body was a steady, grounding presence in the swaying darkness. The immediate danger had passed, but the silence from the man beside her was as vast and unnerving as the desert outside. He hadn't spoken, hadn't moved. He had simply opened his coat, and now he sat, a sentinel of stone. Suddenly, the door at the far end of the car slid open again, not with a bang this time, but with a stealthy scrape of wood on wood. Clara's breath caught. She didn't need to see. She could feel the change in the air, the sudden intrusion of cold menace. A low murmur of voices reached her, too quiet to make out the words. But the tone was sharp, angry. The conductor's voice joined them, high and reedy with fear. "I told you, I didn't see anyone like that." Then, the red-faced man's voice, a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. "You saw nothing? Funny how a few dollars can clear a man's memory, or cloud it." Clara felt a subtle shift beside her. It wasn't a movement so much as a tightening, a gathering of energy. Wade Dalton was no longer a statue. He was a coiled spring. His stillness was now charged, alert. The scarred man spoke, his voice closer now. "Wait a minute, look here." Clara's blood ran cold. Through the tiny gap in the coat, she saw him pointing, not at them, but at the floor by her previous seat, her little canvas sack. In her panic, she had left it behind. It was a pathetic little thing, but it was all she had, and it was the one thing that marked her place. "She was here," the man snarled. "The seat's still warm. She didn't get off at the water tower. She's still on this train." The game was over. The boots began to move again, this time with a grim, methodical purpose. They were no longer searching. They were closing in. Before Clara could even process the new wave of terror, a hand clamped down on her arm. It wasn't rough, but the grip was like iron, absolute and unyielding. Wade's voice was a low rumble against her ear, the first words he had spoken to her. "Don't make a sound. When I move, you move." He was already shifting, pushing the duster aside. The lamplight was a blinding shock after the darkness. He rose to his feet in one fluid motion, pulling her up with him. He was even taller than she'd imagined, a giant of a man who seemed to fill the narrow aisle. For a moment, he blocked the view of the advancing men, his broad back a temporary shield. His gray eyes met hers. They were flinty, focused, stripped of all emotion except a terrifying intensity. He looked past her, toward the window, then back at her. The question was silent but clear. "Do you trust me?" She had no choice. She gave a single, jerky nod. The men saw them. A shout of triumph and rage went up from the red-faced man. "There she is!" Wade didn't wait for them to close the distance. He turned, his hand still locked on Clara's arm, and half dragged, half pulled her toward the other side of the car, away from the men. The other passengers cried out in alarm. scrambling away from them. "The door! Wade!" the scarred man yelled, lunging forward. "He's going for the door!" But Wade wasn't going for the door at the end of the car. He stopped beside a window, his free hand finding the latch. It was rusted shut. With a grunt of effort, he slammed the heel of his hand against the frame. Wood splintered, and the window shot upwards with a screech of protesting metal. A raw, cold wind tore through the car, whipping Clara's hair across her face and making the oil lamps dance wildly. The train was moving fast now, the landscape a blur of black and gray. The clatter of the wheels on the track was a deafening roar. Wade glanced out into the darkness, his eyes scanning the terrain. Then he looked at Clara. "We jump." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, as simple and as final as a death sentence. Clara's mind screamed, "Jump into the rushing rock-strewn darkness at 60 miles an hour." It was suicide. She pulled back, her feet refusing to move. "No, I can't." The men were almost upon them, their faces contorted with fury. The red-faced man was reaching for a pistol tucked into his belt. Wade's grip tightened. He didn't have time to argue. "You can't stay," he said, his voice hard as stone. "Tuck your head. Roll!" He didn't give her another moment to think. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her tight against his side. He was a wall of solid muscle. "Now!" he commanded. And then the world fell away. He threw them both out of the window and into the roaring night. The impact was a violent, shattering explosion of sensation. They hit the steep, gravelly embankment beside the tracks. Not the flat ground. It saved their lives. They tumbled, a tangle of limbs, down the loose scree. Clara screamed, a sound that was ripped from her throat and lost in the wind. Rocks tore at her dress, at her skin. The world was a chaotic, painful blur of motion and noise. Wade's body shielded her from the worst of it, his larger frame taking the brunt of the impacts. They finally rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust at the bottom of the embankment, lying in a heap in the low scrub. The roar of the train was already fading, its red tail lights shrinking into the distance like the dying embers of a fire. And then silence, a profound, ringing silence broken only by Clara's ragged, desperate gasps for air. Every part of her body ached. Her head spun. For a moment, she thought she was dead. Wade disentangled himself and rose to one knee, his breath coming in harsh, controlled pants. He was already scanning their back trail, his head cocked, listening. A long, angry whistle blast echoed across the desert. The train was stopping. "Get up," he ordered, his voice strained but urgent. He pulled her to her feet. Her legs were weak and trembling, threatening to buckle. A sharp pain shot up her ankle. "They're stopping the train," she whimpered, her voice filled with disbelief. "They're coming back." "I know," he said. He didn't waste time on comfort. "We have to move, now. Can you run?" She took a tentative step and cried out as her ankle gave way. I don't know." He swore under his breath, a low, frustrated sound. Without another word, he bent down, hooked a powerful arm under her knees, and lifted her as if she weighed nothing. Clara gasped, her arms instinctively going around his neck. One moment she was a crippled thing on the desert floor. The next she was being carried, held fast against a chest as hard as oak. He started to run. It was not the frantic, clumsy scramble of a man in a panic. It was a ground-eating lope, powerful and sure-footed even in the treacherous, moonless dark. He moved with a knowledge of the land that seemed instinctive, weaving through stands of cholla cactus that glowed like phantom sentinels, his boots finding purchase on the rocky, uneven ground. The desert at night was a different world. It was not empty, but alive with 1,000 unseen things. The air was cool and smelled of dust and creosote. The sky was a terrifyingly vast canopy of brilliant, cold stars. And somewhere behind them, back at the tracks, were the hunters. Clara clung to him, her face pressed against the rough fabric of his shirt. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her cheek, the strain and flex of his muscles as he ran. She was terrified, in pain, and utterly bewildered. Who was this man? Why was he doing this? He was risking his life for her. A stranger. Men didn't do that. The men she knew took. They didn't give. They didn't protect. After what felt like an eternity, he finally slowed, his breathing growing harsher. He found a deep ravine, a black scar in the earth, and slid down the steep side into its shadow-haunted depths. He set her down gently at the bottom, her back against the cold stone of the ravine wall. "Stay here," he whispered. And then he was gone. Scrambling back up the side of the ravine like a goat, he vanished over the lip, melting into the darkness. Clara was alone. The silence rushed in, immense and threatening. Every rustle of a bush, every skittering sound of a lizard on the rocks, sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. She strained her ears, listening for the sound of pursuit. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Where had he gone? Had he abandoned her? Was this some cruel trick, leaving her here, injured and helpless, for the others to find? The questions were a venomous tide in her mind. She hugged her knees to her chest, trying to stifle the sobs that threatened to overwhelm her. She was a fool to trust anyone, especially a man who didn't speak. Then, as silently as he had left, he was back, sliding down the embankment to her side. "They're coming," he said, his voice devoid of panic. "Two of them, on foot, with lanterns. They're following our tracks from the jump." He crouched beside her, his gray eyes assessing her in the dim starlight. "We have to keep moving. The ravine will hide our tracks for a while." He looked at her ankle, which was already beginning to swell. "We'll be slow." It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. He reached into a pocket and pulled out a strip of leather. Deftly, he bound her ankle, pulling the leather tight to give it support. The pressure was painful, but it also felt secure. "Thank you," she whispered. He just grunted in response, already rising. "Lean on me," he said. He half lifted her, taking most of her weight on his own body, and they began to move again, stumbling down the dark, winding path of the dry wash. It was slow, agonizing work. Every step sent a fresh wave of pain through Clara's ankle. The rocks were sharp and slick underfoot, but Wade was a steady presence beside her, a human crutch, his strength a constant reassurance. He still didn't ask questions. He didn't ask who she was or what she'd done. His focus was entirely on the here and now, the next step, the next shadow, the next turn in the ravine. He was a creature of the wilderness, as silent and as watchful as the hawks she'd seen circling during the day. He navigated by starlight and the feel of the ground, his senses alive to the night in a way she couldn't comprehend. Occasionally, he would stop, holding up a hand for silence, listening. In those moments, Clara could hear it too, the faint, distant sound of men calling to each other, their voices thin and ghostly on the night air. The lanterns were still far behind them, bobbing pinpricks of light in the vast darkness, but they were relentless. Clara's mind reeled with a dizzying mix of pain, fear, and a strange, burgeoning curiosity. This man, Wade Dalton, was a puzzle. His silence wasn't empty. It was full of observation, of thought. His actions were swift, decisive, and utterly competent. He moved through this harsh landscape as if he were a part of it. He was a mystery, a dangerous one perhaps, but he was the only thing standing between her and the men who were hunting her. And so she leaned on him, and she followed, one painful step at a time, deeper into the unknown heart of the desert, and deeper into the mystery of the man who was saving her life. They walked through the false dawn, that pale, ghostly hour when the world is drained of color and cast in shades of gray and silver. The night's frantic energy had bled away, replaced by a deep, bone-aching weariness. Clara's pain was a dull, throbbing metronome, a constant rhythm beneath the sound of their stumbling feet and Wade's steady breathing. He still carried most of her weight, his arm a band of steel around her waist, his presence the only thing keeping her upright. The ravine had eventually opened up into a wider, flatter plain dotted with the skeletal arms of Ocotillo and the dark clumps of sagebrush. The hunters' lights had vanished long ago, swallowed by the terrain or by their own surrender to the night. For now, they were safe from pursuit, but they were still adrift in a vast, indifferent wilderness. Clara had stopped thinking about the men on the train. Her world had shrunk to the simple, agonizing task of placing one foot in front of the other. The questions that had swirled in her mind about Wade Dalton had quieted, replaced by a simple, physical reality. He was warm, he was strong, and he was moving them toward something. Toward where? She didn't know or care. Any direction that was away from her past was the right one. As the eastern sky began to blush with the first hints of rose and gold, Wade stopped. He lifted his head, not looking, but sensing. He tasted the air. His gaze swept the horizon, lingering on a distant notch between two flat-topped mesas. "Almost there," he said. The two words were a lifeline. He shifted his grip, taking even more of her weight, and steered them toward the notch. The land began to change. The ground softened from rock to sandy soil. A few hardy blades of grass appeared. Then, as they passed through the gap in the mesas, the world opened up. Before them lay a small, hidden valley, cupped in the hands of the surrounding rock formations. It was a secret world, a pocket of stubborn life in the midst of the arid expanse, a thin ribbon of a creek, lined with a scattering of cottonwood trees whose leaves shivered silver in the nascent light, cut through the center of the valley floor. And at the far end, nestled against the base of the mesa, was a cabin. It wasn't a grand ranch house. It was a small, simple structure of logs, weathered by sun and time to a soft, silvery gray. A thin curl of smoke, almost invisible against the morning sky, rose from a stone chimney. A corral with two horses stood beside it, its fence posts leaning at weary but unyielding angles. The place looked less like it had been built and more like it had grown out of the earth itself, a part of the landscape. It was forgotten, just as the prompt had suggested, a place you could never find unless you already knew it was there. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over Clara. It was a home, after days of running, of sleeping in fear and hiding in shadows. The sight of that simple cabin was more beautiful than any cathedral. Wade seemed to feel her reaction. He slowed his pace, allowing her to take it in. "My place," he said, the words an unnecessary confirmation. They approached the cabin slowly. A wooden porch ran the length of the front, its boards creaking a welcome as Wade finally helped her up the two low steps. He eased her down onto a simple wooden bench beside the door, her legs screaming in protest. "Stay," he said, then turned and went inside. Clara was left alone on the porch, blinking in the growing light. The air here was different. It smelled of wood smoke, damp earth from the creek, and the faint, sweet scent of some unseen desert flower. The silence was profound, broken only by the rustle of the cottonwood leaves and the distant caw of a raven. This place felt safe. The high walls of the mesas stood like silent guardians, cutting the valley off from the rest of the world. The cabin door opened again, but it wasn't Wade. A small boy stood in the doorway, no older than 7. He was small for his age, with a tangle of sun-bleached brown hair and serious, watchful eyes the same stormy gray as Wade's. He held a slingshot in one hand, though it hung loosely at his side, not as a threat but as a familiar comfort. He looked at Clara, his gaze direct and unnervingly perceptive, taking in her torn dress, her bruised face, and her injured ankle without a flicker of surprise. He didn't speak. He simply watched her, another silent inhabitant of this quiet world. Wade appeared behind him, placing a large, gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. The gesture was full of a quiet, unspoken affection that seemed to be the primary language of this place. "Clara, this is Ben," Wade said, his voice softer now. "Ben, this is Clara. She'll be staying with us for a while." Ben gave a small, solemn nod, his eyes still fixed on her. He wasn't afraid or hostile, just curious. Wade stepped aside, holding the door open. "Come inside," he said to Clara. He helped her to her feet, his arm once again a solid support, and guided her over the threshold. The inside of the cabin was one large room, spare but immaculately clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A sturdy table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A cast-iron stove radiated a gentle warmth that pushed back the morning chill. 2 simple cots were built into the far wall, their blankets neatly folded. It was a man's home, simple and functional, but there was an order to it, a sense of peace. It smelled of coffee, bacon, and wood smoke. Wade led her to one of the chairs at the table and eased her into it. "Keep your foot up," he instructed, pulling the other chair over for her to rest her swollen ankle on. He then moved to a dry sink in the corner, working a hand pump until water gushed into a tin basin. He brought it to her, along with a clean, rough cloth and a small sliver of lye soap. "Wash up," he said. Clara stared at the basin as if it were a miracle. The simple act of washing felt like a forgotten luxury. She dipped her hands into the cool, clean water, the shock of it a welcome jolt. She scrubbed at the grime on her hands and face, watching the water turn gray. She washed away the dust of the train, the grit of the desert floor, the phantom touch of the men who had hunted her. When she was done, she looked at her reflection in the small, cracked piece of mirror hanging by the door. A stranger looked back, a pale, exhausted girl with dark circles under her wide, frightened eyes, a cut on her cheek, and hair full of dust and twigs. But it was her. She was still here. While she washed, Wade moved about the cabin with a quiet efficiency. He stoked the fire in the stove and put a large coffee pot on to boil. He took a skillet from a hook on the wall and began slicing thick slabs of bacon from a side of salt pork. Ben, the boy, moved to a small cupboard, taking out 3 tin plates and 3 mugs, setting them on the table with a seriousness that suggested this was his regular chore. He did it all without a word, moving in a silent, practiced dance with the man. They were a unit, these two, a strange, silent family. Clara watched them, her heart aching with a feeling she couldn't name. It was a mixture of gratitude, bewilderment, and a profound, lonely envy. The smell of frying bacon and boiling coffee filled the small cabin, a rich, comforting aroma that made Clara's empty stomach clench with hunger. When the food was ready, Wade served it onto the plates, a generous portion of crispy bacon and 2 fried eggs for each of them. He placed a plate in front of her, then poured steaming black coffee into the 3 mugs. Clara stared down at the food. It was the first real meal she had seen in days. The last she'd eaten was a stale piece of bread she had stolen from a baker's cart before boarding the train. She picked up the fork, her hand trembling slightly. The 3 of them ate in silence. It wasn't an awkward or uncomfortable silence. It was a peaceful quiet, the kind that exists between people who don't need words to fill the space. The only sounds were the clink of forks against tin plates and the crackle of the fire in the stove. Ben ate neatly, his eyes on his plate. Wade ate with the slow, steady rhythm of a man who savored his food. Clara took her first bite, and the simple, salty taste of the bacon was so overwhelmingly good that tears pricked her eyes. She ate slowly, deliberately, making the meal last. With each bite, she felt some of the tension and fear that had been coiled in her gut for days begin to unwind. This food was more than just sustenance. It was an anchor. It was a quiet declaration that she was safe, that the running was over, at least for now. As she ate, she looked around the small cabin again. She saw a rifle mounted over the fireplace and a worn leather gun belt with a holstered pistol hanging from a peg by the door. This was still the West, and this was still a dangerous land. Wade Dalton was a man who knew how to handle himself. But here, within these four walls, he had created a small pocket of civilization, a refuge. She looked at the boy, Ben, and wondered about his story. Wade had said staying with us, not with me and my boy. He was not his son. So who was he, another stray? Another soul that had washed up on the shores of Wade Dalton's quiet mercy. She looked at the cabin, at the man and the boy, and she realized the truth of it. This little homestead at the end of the valley wasn't just a home. It was a sanctuary for those the world had discarded. And now, she was one of them. The thought didn't frighten her. For the first time in a very long time, it felt like hope. The meal settled in Clara's stomach, a warm, heavy anchor in the sea of her exhaustion. After they had finished, Ben, with a quiet look from Wade, took a small wooden horse from a box in the corner and went outside to the porch, content to be lost in his own silent world. The cabin grew quieter still, the space now holding only the two of them. Wade rose from the table, his movements deliberate. He stoked the stove, then retrieved a small wooden box from a high shelf. He brought it back to the table, along with a basin of water, now refilled and clean. He knelt before her without a word, his large frame making the small cabin seem even smaller. He gently took her foot in his hands, his touch surprisingly careful, and began to unwrap the makeshift leather binding. Clara flinched, not from pain, but from the simple, unexpected contact. It had been so long since anyone had touched her with anything resembling care. Her father's touch had become rough and impatient. The man he'd sold her to. She shuddered, pushing the memory away. Wade's hands were different. They were calloused and scarred. The hands of a man who worked the earth and wrestled with life. But they were steady. They held her injured ankle with a firmness that was supportive, not confining. He examined the swelling. His gray eyes narrowed in concentration. "It's a bad sprain, but not broken," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. It was the first full sentence he'd directed at her since the ravine. He worked in silence, cleaning the scrapes with a wetted cloth. Each dab was gentle, methodical. He then took a salve from the box, its sharp, clean scent of pine and herbs filling the air, and began to work it into her skin. His focus was absolute, his attention entirely on the task, on the mending of what was broken. The quiet, focused care was her undoing. It was too much. It was a kindness so foreign it felt like a physical blow, breaking down the walls she had so carefully constructed. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, then another. Soon, a quiet, choked sob escaped her lips. Wade's hand stilled for a moment. He didn't look up at her face, but he knew. He simply waited, giving her the space to cry. "Why?" she finally whispered, the word ragged. "Why did you help me?" He resumed his work, wrapping her ankle in a clean strip of cotton cloth from the box. He didn't answer immediately. He tied off the bandage with a neat, practical knot before finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were like the desert sky before a storm, impossible to read, yet holding a universe of depth. "You needed help," he said, as if it were the simplest, most obvious reason in the world, as if it required no further explanation. He then stood, taking the basin of dirty water and tossing it out the door before placing the basin by the dry sink. His simple answer, devoid of pity or expectation, opened the floodgates. The story she had held captive in her chest, a toxic, festering secret, clawed its way out. "My father," she began, her voice trembling. "He wasn't always a hard man. My mother, she passed from a fever 6 winters ago. She was the sun in our house. When her light went out, everything in him just withered. He had a small claim up in the mountains. He was always chasing the next big strike, the one that would make us rich. But the gold never came, just more debt." She stared at her hands, twisting them in the lap of her ruined dress. It felt strange to speak of it, to give voice to the shame that had been her silent companion for so long. We lost the claim, then the house. We moved into a room behind the general store in town. He started spending his nights at Abernathy's saloon. At first, he just drank. Then he started playing cards. He wasn't any better at cards than he was at mining. Wade had moved to the table, gathering their empty plates. He carried them to the sink, his back to her, but she knew he was listening. Every line of his body was attentive. "Mr. Abernathy," she said the name, and a wave of nausea rolled through her. "He owns the saloon. He's older, over 40. He has a wife buried on the hill, and a reputation. Men fear him. Women avoid him. He has these soft, damp hands, and his eyes, they look at you like you're something to be bought and consumed. He started letting my father's debts grow. He was kind to him. They said, generous. He'd send a bottle home with him, clap him on the back." She took a shuddering breath, the memory vivid and suffocating. "One night, my father came back to our room. He couldn't look at me. He just stood by the door, turning his hat over and over in his hands. He told me that Mr. Abernathy had forgiven all his debts, that we were saved. He said Mr. Abernathy was a good man, a respected man, and that he wanted a new wife, a young one, to give him sons." The plates clattered softly as Wade set them in the basin. He began to work the pump, the rhythmic squeak a steady counterpoint to her faltering voice. "He sold me," she said, the words finally out, raw and ugly. "He didn't use that word, of course. He called it a marriage, an arrangement. He said it was my duty. He said I would have a fine house, wear silk dresses. He told me I should be grateful. Grateful!" She spat the word like poison. The wedding was to be in 2 days, a small affair, just the preacher and him. Mr. Abernathy came to the room the day after, to see his bride. He brought me a gift, a silver locket. He tried to put it around my neck himself. His fingers brushed my skin. Clara's voice broke. She wrapped her arms around herself, a reflexive, protective gesture. I felt soiled, trapped, like a rabbit in a snare, just waiting for the hunter to return. That night, I couldn't sleep. All I could see were his eyes. All I could feel were his fingers. I knew that if I stayed, if I let that man claim me, whatever was left of me inside would die. I would just be a body in a fine house. She looked up, her vision blurred with tears, and saw Wade's reflection in the small mirror. He was standing perfectly still, his hands submerged in the soapy water, watching her. Not her face, but her reflection. His expression was grim, his jaw set like granite. There was a darkness in his eyes, a flicker of something ancient and dangerous. It wasn't pity. It was a cold, quiet rage, directed not at her, but at the world that had done this to her. Seeing that look, that silent, shared anger, gave her the strength to finish. "So I ran," she whispered. "I took the few coins my mother had left me, stuffed a dress in a sack, and climbed out the window while my father was snoring in his chair. I just ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get on a train heading west, as far away as I could get. Every man who looked at me, I thought he had been sent by Abernathy. I thought they would drag me back." She finally fell silent, the story told. The cabin was filled with the echo of her words, the weight of her confession. She felt empty, scraped raw. She had laid the ugliest, most broken parts of herself at this silent man's feet. And she waited for the judgment, the disgust, the dismissal. She looked at him, her heart pounding. "I'm afraid," she confessed, the words barely audible. "That's the root of it all. I'm afraid of men. I'm afraid of being touched. I don't know what I'm supposed to be, how a wife is supposed to act. I don't know how to do anything without doing it wrong. I'm afraid I'm worthless now, broken." Wade turned from the sink. He wiped his hands on a cloth, his movement slow, measured. He walked not to her, but to the stack of wood by the stove and added a log to the fire, coaxing the flames with a poker. He performed the simple, domestic chore with the same focused intent he'd used on her ankle. Then he came back to the sink, standing beside where she sat, and began to wash the dishes. He didn't speak. He offered no words of comfort, no empty promises that everything would be all right. He simply stood beside her, a solid, unmoving presence, and washed the plates from their shared meal. The soft scrub of the cloth against tin, the splash of water, the clink of metal, the sounds were mundane, ordinary. They were the sounds of a home, the sounds of a day continuing. He was not looking at her, but she could feel his attention. His silence was not an absence of response. It was the response itself. It was a quiet, profound statement. It said, "I heard you. I am still here. This place is still safe." It said, "You are not broken. You are a survivor." As he worked, he glanced at her, just for a moment. His gray eyes were clear, and the darkness she had seen in them was gone, replaced by something else, an understanding, an acceptance that went deeper than words. And in that look, Clara felt a tiny, fragile seed of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't quite hope, not yet, but it was the soil in which hope might, one day, begin to grow. The days that followed bled into one another, marked not by the calendar, but by the slow, predictable journey of the sun across the vast, blue canvas of the valley sky. The sharp-edged terror of the chase began to dull, its memory receding like a nightmare in the steady light of a new reality. Life in Wade Dalton's hidden homestead was a quiet, rhythmic thing, governed by the needs of the land and the animals, and a profound, unspoken understanding that seemed to flow between its inhabitants like the water in the creek. Clara's ankle healed slowly. For the first week, she was largely confined to the chair by the table or the bench on the porch, a frustrated and helpless observer. Wade would change the bandage each morning with the same impersonal, focused care, his movements efficient, his touch gentle. He never commented on her progress, but she would notice him leaving the water bucket closer to the door, or placing a stool just within her reach. They were small, silent concessions to her injury, acknowledgments that were more comforting than any spoken words of sympathy could ever be. It was during this time that she learned the rhythm of the place. Wade and Ben were the first to rise, moving about in the pre-dawn gloom with a practiced quiet that never disturbed her sleep. She would wake to the smell of coffee already brewing and the sight of Wade standing on the porch, a dark silhouette against the lavender sky, simply watching the day arrive. After a simple breakfast of coffee and oatmeal, their work would begin. Wade was a man in constant, purposeful motion. He was the heart of the small ranch, and his labor was the steady beat that kept it alive. Clara would watch from the porch as he mended a section of the corral fence, his hammer blows echoing cleanly in the morning air. He worked with an economy of movement, wasting no effort, his body a study in practical strength. He cleared stones from the small patch of land they used for a garden, hauled water for the two sturdy horses, and spent long afternoons in the saddle, riding the perimeter of the valley, checking on unseen things. He never seemed to rush, yet his work was relentless. Ben was his shadow. The boy was too small for the heavier tasks, but he had his own set of chores. He fed the chickens in their small coop, collected their eggs in a little basket, and was tasked with pulling the stubborn weeds that grew around the cabin. He worked with the same solemn focus as Wade, his small face a mask of concentration as he battled a particularly tough root. Often, he would sit near where Wade worked, simply watching, learning the language of labor through observation. Feeling useless was a torment to Clara. She had been saved, sheltered, and fed. She could not bear to be a mere burden. As soon as she could limp without searing pain, she began to claim her own place in the rhythm of the homestead. She started with the cabin. It was already clean, but she made it hers. She scrubbed the wooden floors until they shone, washed the few windows until the morning light streamed in. and kept the fire in the stove fed and glowing. Her greatest comfort, she discovered, was in cooking. Her mother had taught her the simple alchemy of turning flour, water, and salt into bread. The first time she tried, using the sack of flour she found in their small pantry. She was clumsy, her hands unsure, but the familiar motions came back to her, the kneading of the dough, the feel of it coming alive under her palms, the patient waiting for it to rise. When she pulled the first golden brown loaf from the oven, the cabin filled with a warm, wholesome scent it hadn't had before. That evening, when Wade and Ben came in for supper, the loaf sat in the center of the table. Neither of them commented on it, but Wade cut a thick slice for Ben and one for himself. And the quiet satisfaction Clara felt as she watched them eat was a balm to her bruised soul. It was a tangible thing, a contribution. It was proof that she could create something good and whole. From then on, the kitchen became her domain. She found that their supplies, while simple, were plentiful. There were sacks of beans and flour, tins of coffee, and a small, flourishing garden that provided onions, potatoes, and hardy greens. She learned to make stews that would simmer all day, filling the cabin with a savory aroma that welcomed them home in the evening. She learned the simple joy of providing a hot meal to two people who had clearly survived on far less. She also took on the mending. Ben's clothes, in particular, were in a constant state of disrepair. He was a boy who climbed rocks and chased lizards, and his trousers and shirts paid the price. Clara found Wade's mending kit a simple roll of leather containing a few sturdy needles and spools of thick thread. She would sit on the porch in the afternoon sun, the boy's small shirt in her lap, and stitch the tiers with a neat, careful lines. Her mother had called a well-mended seam a line of love. As Clara sewed, she felt a flicker of that sentiment, a strange, protective affection for the quiet boy who had accepted her presence without question. Sometimes, Ben would bring her things, a feather of a hawk, a curiously shaped stone from the creek bed, a fat, sleepy, horned toad cupped in his small hands. He would present them to her without a word, his gray eyes searching hers. She would thank him just as quietly, and he would give a small, satisfied nod and go about his day. They were offerings, small bridges of trust built between two quiet souls. Through all this, her interactions with Wade remained spare. They exchanged few words beyond what was necessary. Supper's ready. The bucket is full. Good morning. Yet, a different kind of communication was growing between them, a language of small, silent gestures. One afternoon, the sun was particularly hot. Clara was sitting on the porch steps, her mending in her lap, her face flushed from the heat. Wade came from the corral, leading one of the horses. He stopped at the water barrel, drank deeply from the dipper, and then, without looking at her, he filled the dipper again and placed it on the porch railing beside her before continuing on to the creek. It was a simple act, but it spoke volumes. He had seen she was hot. He had thought of her. The cool water was a gift, an acknowledgement of her presence, her comfort. Another day. An unexpected chill had come with the evening, exhausted from a day of more walking than she was used to. Clara had fallen asleep in the chair after supper, the warmth from the stove lulling her into a deep slumber. She woke with a start in the middle of the night to find herself covered with a thick wool blanket. Wade was asleep on his cot across the room, his breathing deep and even. He had seen her sleeping, had seen she might get cold, and had covered her. He had tended to her comfort without waking her, without seeking thanks. These gestures were like threads, slowly and carefully stitching the tattered edges of her soul back together. She had fled a world where men took what they wanted, where affection was a transaction and care was a performance. Wade's kindness was a different thing entirely. It was as quiet and as sturdy as he was. It was baked into the bread she made, present in the neat stitches of a mended seam, and reflected in the silent offerings of a cup of water. She started to feel a sense of safety that was deeper than just being hidden from her pursuers. It was a safety of the spirit, here, in this quiet valley. She was not an object to be appraised, a property to be sold, or a burden to be tolerated. She was just Clara, a person who cooked and cleaned and mended, who sat on the porch and watched the sunset paint the mesas in fiery colors. One evening, as she stood by the creek, watching the water flow over the smooth stones, she realized that the constant knot of fear in her stomach had finally, truly, loosened. She could breathe. The air felt clean, the silence felt peaceful, and the future, which had once been a terrifying black void, now seemed like a simple, quiet path, leading from one sunrise to the next. She had arrived as a frightened girl, running from the world, but here, in the silence and the steady rhythm of daily work, she was slowly, quietly, putting down roots. The valley had become her world, and she was slowly learning its language. It was a language written not in words, but in the slant of the afternoon light on the mesas, the shifting song of the creek, and the patient, cyclical rhythm of the days. As the weeks turned into a month, and her ankles strengthened from a painful liability to a barely noticeable ache, Clara found herself venturing further from the immediate orbit of the cabin. She began to take walks along the creek bed, her steps tentative at first, then growing in confidence. These walks were a pilgrimage of sorts, a way of acquainting herself with the geography of her own survival. The valley, which had at first seemed a uniform expanse of rock and scrub, began to reveal its secrets to her. She discovered the resilience of the desert flora, the fierce, protective spines of the hedgehog cactus that, for a few brilliant days in spring, would crown themselves with shockingly pink blossoms, the tough, leathery leaves of the sagebrush that released a clean, sharp scent when crushed between her fingers, the stubborn grace of the cottonwoods that clung to the life-giving water of the creek. She saw a reflection of herself in this landscape. It was a place of harsh realities and profound, unadorned beauty. It did not pretend to be soft or gentle. Yet, within its ruggedness, life persisted with a tenacious, quiet strength. Like her, it had learned to survive on very little, to find nourishment in the smallest of things. One afternoon, she wandered further than usual, following a game trail that wound up the rocky slope of the eastern mesa. It was here, in a small cleft between two enormous gray boulders, that she saw it. It was a single, tiny wildflower, no bigger than her thumb. It had 5 delicate petals of the most brilliant, buttery yellow, a spot of pure, defiant sunshine blooming on a stem no thicker than a thread. It grew from a crack in the rock, a testament to the impossible will of life to find a foothold in the most barren of places. A flower of gold, born from stone. Clara knelt, mesmerized. The flower seemed to her a miracle, a secret whispered by the desert. It was so small, so fragile, yet so perfectly formed. It asked for nothing. It simply existed, a spot of beauty for its own sake. In its lonely resilience, she felt a profound kinship. It was a survivor, just like her. A sudden, strange impulse seized her. She wanted to share it. She wanted to bring this small piece of defiant beauty back to the cabin, the place that had become her own cleft in the rock. Carefully, she picked the flower, its thin stem cool against her fingers. She carried it back to the homestead, cupped gently in her palm as if it were a tiny flame she had to protect from the wind. She didn't know what to do with it. Giving it directly to Wade felt too forward, too bold. It was a gesture whose meaning she didn't fully understand herself, and she feared it would be lost or misread. So she did the only thing that felt right. She walked up the porch steps and placed the tiny yellow flower on the top step, right in the middle, where it couldn't be missed. She added no note, spoke no word. It was just an offering, left to be found, a silent statement. I was here, I saw this, I thought of this place. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks as she turned and went inside, a strange mixture of shyness and hope fluttering in her chest. She half expected Wade to come in later, see the flower, and brush it aside with his boot, a piece of irrelevant trail dust. He came in from the corral as the sun began to set, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. Ben trailed behind him. Clara watched through the window as Wade stopped on the porch, his gaze falling to the step. He paused for a long moment, his head tilted. She saw him bend down, his large, calloused fingers surprisingly deft as he picked up the tiny flower. He looked at it, turning it over once. Then he straightened up and came inside, the flower still held carefully in his hand. He said nothing about it. He placed it on the mantelpiece of the stone fireplace as he passed, and the conversation, as always, remained unspoken. Clara's heart beat a little faster. He hadn't discarded it. He had brought it inside. He had given it a place of honor. The next day, the flower was gone from the mantelpiece. A pang of disappointment, sharp and surprisingly painful, went through her. He had thrown it away after all. She chided herself for her foolishness, for placing so much meaning on such a small thing. Later that morning, while Wade was out checking a fence line and Ben was down by the creek, Clara took it upon herself to bring a sense of order to the main table. There were a few of Wade's things scattered on it, a whetstone, a small pouch of tobacco, and a thin, leather-bound notebook, worn soft with use and tied shut with a leather thong. As she reached to move it, the thong, which was loosely tied, came undone, and the notebook fell open. Tucked between 2 pages was her flower. It was perfectly preserved, its vibrant yellow petals pressed flat against the page, a permanent stain of color against the off-white paper. He hadn't thrown it away. He had saved it. He had made it a part of his world, a part of the book where he kept his accounts, his notes, the quiet records of his life. He had seen her small, silent offering and had answered with a silent act of preservation. Clara closed the book gently, her hands trembling. A warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so potent and unfamiliar that it almost frightened her. It was a feeling of being truly seen, of an unspoken message received and understood completely. The silence between them was not empty. It was a vessel, and it was beginning to fill with a quiet, shared understanding that was more powerful than any words could be. The conversation of deeds continued. A few days later, Clara took her mending basket and went to her favorite spot. It was a large, flat slab of sandstone that jutted out over the creek, warmed by the afternoon sun. It offered a clear view of the valley, and the gentle sound of the water was a soothing companion to her work. She had claimed this small space as her own. As she approached the rock, she saw that something was different. Placed neatly in the center of the rock was a folded piece of tanned sheepskin, its fleece soft and thick. Next to it was a tin cup of cool water from the barrel, a few beads of condensation glistening on its side. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She knew, with absolute certainty, who had left them there. Wade. He had seen her sitting here on the hard, bare rock day after day. He had noticed her habit, had recognized this as her place, and in his silent, practical way, he had offered her comfort. He hadn't asked if she wanted a cushion. He hadn't made a show of his thoughtfulness. He had simply seen a need and met it. The sheepskin was for her comfort. The water was for her thirst. She ran her hand over the soft wool, a wave of tenderness washing over her so intense it made her dizzy. This was his reply to her flower. Her gesture had been one of beauty. His was one of care. It was a conversation, held across the space of days and the silence of the valley. "I see you." Her flower had said, "I see you too." His offering replied. She sat down on the soft fleece, her sewing forgotten in her lap. She looked out across the valley, at the cabin with its curl of smoke, at the sturdy corral, at the man in the distance, patiently replacing a fence post. He was a part of this land, as rugged and as steadfast as the mesas. She had come here as a fugitive, expecting nothing but a temporary hiding place. She had been prepared for a world of harshness, of suspicion, of men who took. Wade Dalton was none of those things. His kindness was not a currency he used to buy favor. It was a fundamental part of his nature, as quiet and as essential as his own breathing. He had given her sanctuary, asked for nothing in return, and in the silence, had begun to show her that a man's touch could be gentle, his presence a comfort, his strength a shield and not a weapon. A new feeling began to bloom in the once barren soil of her heart. It was as small, as fragile, and as tenacious as the yellow wildflower on the rock. It was a quiet, certain affection that grew stronger with each unspoken gesture, each shared silence. It was not a wild, passionate flame, but a slow, steady warmth, a pilot light that had been kindled in the dark and was now, finally, beginning to glow. She didn't have a name for it yet, but as she watched him work under the vast, open sky, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that it was real. The peace of the valley was most profound in the moments just after sunset. The day's heat would rise from the earth in a final, shimmering sigh, and the air would grow cool and sweet with the scent of dust and night-blooming flowers. The mesas, which stood as stark, sun-baked sentinels during the day, would soften into deep purple shadows against a sky strewn with the first diamond chips of stars. It was a time of quiet, a time of winding down. Inside the cabin, the single oil lamp on the table cast a warm, golden glow, pushing the darkness into the corners of the room. The fire in the stove crackled softly, a cheerful, domestic sound. Supper was over, and the three of them were settled into the comfortable rhythm of their evening. Clara stood at the dry sink, washing the tin plates, her movements methodical and soothing. Ben sat on the floor by the hearth, carefully carving a piece of soft pine with a small, dull knife that Wade had given him, his face a study in deep concentration. Wade himself sat at the table, cleaning his rifle. The soft scrape and click of oiled metal, a familiar and reassuring sound. The sanctuary they had built was woven from these quiet moments. It was a fragile thing, built of unspoken trust and shared labor. But to Clara, it felt more real and more solid than any place she had ever known. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long had become a distant ghost, a memory from another life. Here, she was not hunted. Here, she was safe. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence, not the comfortable silence of the cabin, but a sudden, unnatural stillness from outside, the chirping of the crickets, which had been a constant, gentle chorus, abruptly stopped. Wade's hands froze on the rifle. He lifted his head, his body instantly alert, his gray eyes fixed on the dark square of the window. He was a predator who had sensed another predator in his territory. Clara felt a cold prickle of unease on the back of her neck. She turned from the sink, her hands still dripping with soapy water. Ben looked up, his eyes wide and questioning. Then came the sound. It was the sharp, unmistakable whinny of a horse in distress, followed by a low, angry snort. Not their horses. Theirs were calm, accustomed to the valley's quiet. Wade was on his feet in an instant, his movements fluid and silent. He laid the rifle on the table and crossed to the door in 2 long strides, his hand resting on the heavy wooden bar that secured it. He didn't speak, but his look to Clara was a clear command. "Get Ben. Stay back." Clara's heart began a frantic, heavy thudding against her ribs. She moved quickly to Ben, pulling him to his feet and backing away toward the darkest corner of the cabin, her body shielding his small frame. A man's voice, rough and slurred with whiskey, cut through the night. "No need to be shy. Dalton, we know you're in there, and we know who you're hiding." It was him, the red-faced man from the train. The voice was a key that unlocked the cage of Clara's old fears, and they came swarming out, cold and venomous. Another voice, the scarred man's cruel sneer. "Join the first. Abernathy pays well for his property. We're just here to collect." Wade's face was a mask carved from stone. His eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. He was no longer the quiet rancher. He was the man who had thrown them from a speeding train, a creature of pure, cold purpose. Suddenly, the cabin door exploded inward. It didn't open. It was shattered from its hinges by the force of a heavy boot, the wooden bar splintering with a sound like breaking bones. 3 figures filled the doorway. Black silhouettes against the star-dusted night. The red-faced man, a cruel smile on his lips. The scarred man, his eyes gleaming with malice. And a third, a lanky, rat-faced man she hadn't seen before. The fragile peace of the cabin was annihilated in an instant. The lamp on the table flickered wildly in the sudden draft, casting their shadows, huge and monstrous, against the walls. "There's the little bird," the red-faced man grunted, his eyes locking on Clara. "Prettier than I remembered." They advanced into the room, spreading out, their intentions brutally clear. Wade didn't wait for them to make the first move. With a roar of pure, primal rage, he launched himself forward. He moved with a speed and ferocity that was shocking. He grabbed the nearest chair and swung it like a club. Catching the rat-faced man squarely in the chest, the man went down with a strangled gasp, the chair shattering into pieces around him. But the other 2 were on him. The scarred man lunged, a long knife flashing in the lamplight. Wade caught his wrist, their bodies slamming together as they wrestled for control of the blade. They crashed against the table, sending plates and the oil lamp tumbling to the floor. The room was plunged into a terrifying, flickering dimness, lit only by the red glow of the fire in the stove. The red-faced man circled them, looking for an opening. He saw Wade occupied and charged, his bulk like that of a rampaging bull. He drove his shoulder into Wade's side, breaking his hold on the knife wielder. The fight devolved into a desperate, grunting brawl. It was a whirlwind of violent motion, of thudding fists and splintering wood. Clara, paralyzed with terror, could only watch, her arms wrapped tightly around Ben, who was whimpering, his face buried in her dress. Wade was a force of nature. He fought with the raw, untamed fury of a cornered grizzly. He landed a blow that sent the scarred man staggering back, blood pouring from his nose. He ducked under a wild swing from the red-faced man and drove his fist deep into the man's gut, doubling him over. For a moment, it seemed he might win. It seemed his strength and his rage would be enough. But the odds were too great. The rat-faced man had recovered, and he scrambled to his feet, grabbing a heavy piece of firewood from the pile by the stove. As Wade turned to face the renewed attack from the red-faced man, the rat-faced man swung the log with all his might. It caught Wade on the side of the head. The sound was a sickening, wet crack that cut through the noise of the fight. Wade's body went rigid. His eyes widened in a brief, unseeing moment of shock. And then he crumpled. He fell like a great tree, without a sound, his body hitting the floorboards with a heavy, final thud. He lay still, a dark pool of blood beginning to spread from under his head in the dim, red firelight. A roaring silence descended on the cabin. To Clara, it felt as if the world had ended. The protector, the mountain of a man who had been her shield, was gone. The 3 men stood over him, panting, their chests heaving. The scarred man wiped the blood from his face with the back of his hand, a triumphant, ugly smirk twisting his lips. "That's the end of that," he rasped. He turned, and his eyes, cold and predatory, fell on Clara and the boy. Now, for the prize. That was the moment something inside Clara broke, or perhaps it was the moment something new was forged. The terror was still there, a shrieking thing in the back of her mind. But seeing the look in that man's eyes, seeing him start to move toward Ben, another instinct rose to meet it. It was a fierce, maternal rage she never knew she possessed. "You will not touch this child." Her eyes darted around the ruined room, searching for a weapon, for anything, and then she saw it, mounted over the fireplace. where Wade had left it. The rifle. She didn't think. She acted. She pushed Ben behind her, whispering "stay," and scrambled across the floor. Her hands, slick with a cold sweat, fumbled for the heavy weapon. It was heavier than she could have imagined, cold and alien in her grasp. She had never held a gun in her life. She didn't know how to load it, how to aim it. She only knew it was their last, and only hope. She managed to pull it from the rack and turn, her body trembling so violently she could barely hold it steady. She tried to lift it to her shoulder, mimicking the way she had seen Wade hold it, but it was too heavy, too awkward. The men stopped, their triumphant expressions turning to ones of amused contempt. "Ah, look at that," the red-faced man chuckled, wincing as he straightened up. "The little bird thinks she can fly. Put it down, girl, before you hurt yourself." He took a step toward her, and then, from the darkness outside, a new voice boomed. A voice like rocks grinding together. "I do as she says." A figure stepped into the ruined doorway. It was an old man. His back stooped with age, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He was wiry, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, a thin white beard clinging to his chin. It was Raoul, an old ranch hand she'd seen only a few times, who lived in a small shack further down the creek and kept to himself. In his hands, he held a double-barreled shotgun, and its twin muzzles were pointed squarely at the red-faced man's chest. The intruders froze. The shotgun, in the hands of the old man, was an entirely different proposition from the rifle in the hands of a terrified girl. "This ain't your fight, old man," the scarred man snarled. "This is Dalton's land," Raoul said, his voice flat and cold. "Anything that happens on it is my fight. Now get away from the boy and the girl." For a tense, silent moment, no one moved. Then, the red-faced man made a decision. He lunged, not at Raoul, but at Clara, thinking her the easier target. Raoul didn't hesitate. The shotgun roared, a deafening concussive blast that shook the very logs of the cabin. The shot didn't hit anyone. It splintered the floorboards a foot in front of the man's feet, a spray of wood and lead that made him cry out and stumble back. That was the opening Clara needed. The blast, the momentary chaos, shocked her out of her paralysis. Her finger, white-knuckled, was already on the trigger. Acting on pure, desperate instinct, she squeezed. The rifle bucked against her shoulder like a living thing, slamming into her with a force that sent a brutal, bruising shock through her whole body. The report was deafening in the enclosed space, and the smell of gunpowder filled her nostrils. She hadn't aimed. She had simply pointed. The red-faced man screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and collapsed, clutching his thigh where a dark, wet stain was rapidly spreading across his trousers. The fight was over. The sight of their leader on the floor, screaming, and the old man calmly leveling the shotgun for a second shot, broke the nerve of the other two. They were bullies and thieves, not warriors. The scarred man grabbed the rat-faced man, and together they dragged their wounded, moaning leader out of the cabin and into the night. Their panicked footsteps faded, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence, the smell of gunpowder, and the scene of utter devastation. Raoul stepped fully into the cabin, the shotgun still held at the ready, and looked at Clara. His old eyes were filled not with judgment, but with a grim, weary respect. "They're gone. They won't be back." But Clara didn't hear him. The rifle slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor. The adrenaline that had fueled her vanished, leaving her weak and shaking. Her warrior moment was over. Her gaze was fixed on the still, silent figure lying in the spreading pool of blood on the floor. She stumbled across the ruined room and fell to her knees beside Wade. The world, which had exploded into a nightmare of sound and violence, collapsed into a single, terrifying point of focus. Wade, lying broken on the floor of his own home. The echoes of the gunshots faded. replaced by a profound, ringing silence broken only by the ragged sound of Clara's own breathing and the soft, whimpering cries of the boy behind her. She knelt in the spreading pool of his blood, the warmth of it seeping through the thin fabric of her dress. Her hands hovered over him, trembling, useless. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't touch him for fear of hurting him more. She couldn't bear not to touch him. His face, usually so controlled and stoic, was slack, his skin a waxy, unnatural pale in the dim firelight. The blood matted his dark hair, flowing from a vicious gash on the side of his head. He was utterly still, too still. Raoul's heavy boots trod softly on the floorboards beside her. He knelt, his old joints creaking, and his gnarled, steady hand went to Wade's neck. Clara held her breath, her entire being suspended in the infinite, agonizing space of that single second. "He's alive!" The old man's voice was a low, gravelly rumble, but they were the most beautiful words she had ever heard. "Pulse is there. Faint, but it's there." A sob, thick with relief and terror, tore its way from Clara's throat. Life. There was still life. "The boy," Raoul said, his sharp eyes finding Ben, who was huddled in the corner, his small body shaking uncontrollably. "He can't stay here." Raoul rose and went to the child, speaking in a low, soothing tone. He wrapped a blanket around Ben's shoulders and gently led him toward the door. "I'll take him to my shack. I'll come back." And then they were alone. The door closed, shutting out the night and leaving Clara in the ruined cabin with the man who had saved her life, and who was now losing his own onto the floor. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it on his chest. Beneath her palm, she could feel the faint, fluttery, stubborn beat of his heart. It was a fragile miracle. She leaned down, her hair brushing his cheek, her lips close to his ear. The words came not from her mind, but from the deepest, most terrified part of her soul. "Don't you leave me," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. Tears streamed down her face, falling onto his still form. "Wade, you can't leave me. I don't want to be alone anymore." It was the truest thing she had ever said. The thought of losing him, of this sanctuary being shattered and her being cast out into the world alone again, was a terror far greater than any fear of the men who had just fled. They could hurt her body. Losing Wade would destroy what was left of her spirit. With a strength born of pure desperation, she knew she had to act. She tore a strip from the hem of her already ruined dress and pressed it gently against the wound on his head, trying to staunch the bleeding. His skin was cold and clammy. Raoul returned as promised, his face a grim mask. Together, they managed to move him. It was a slow, agonizing process. Wade was a dead weight, a mountain of a man, and lifting him felt like trying to move the earth itself. They cleared the splintered remains of the table and laid him on his own cot, the one he had given up for her on that first night. And so the vigil began. The hours that followed were a blur of fear and frantic, focused work. Raoul, ever practical, set a large pot of water to boil, while Clara, guided by some instinct she didn't know she possessed, found the wooden medicine box again. They cleaned the wound as best they could, a deep, ugly cut that left a palpable dent in the bone beneath. Clara stitched it closed with a needle and thread from the mending kit, her hands shaking so badly that each stitch was a small, clumsy prayer. Her tears fell onto his face as she worked, baptizing him in her grief and her hope. The first night passed in a terrifying silence, broken only by his shallow, ragged breaths. A fever set in, a dry, consuming heat that radiated from his body. Clara did not sleep. She sat on a low stool beside his cot, a permanent fixture in the dim light. She kept a constant rotation of cool, wet cloths on his forehead, bathing his face, his neck, his hands, trying to fight the fire that was consuming him from within. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist. Raoul came and went, a silent, supportive ghost. He brought her broth, which she ignored. He tended the fire. He assured her Ben was safe, sleeping, though frightened. But Clara's universe had shrunk to the space of this small, fever-hot room, to the man lying so perilously close to death. She talked to him constantly, a low, desperate murmur. "You have to fight. Wade, you're a fighter. I saw you. You can't give up. Ben needs you. I need you. Just open your eyes. Please, Wade, just open your eyes." On the second day, the fever worsened. He began to drift in and out of a restless delirium, muttering words she couldn't understand, his hands clenching at the blanket. In those moments, he seemed to be wrestling with demons only he could see, his body racked with tremors. Clara would hold his hand, her touch gentle but firm, her voice a constant, soothing anchor in his storm. "I'm here, Wade. It's Clara. You're safe. I'm right here." The days and nights became a single, seamless stretch of time, measured only by the changing of the cloths on his head and the level of the water in the bucket. She was an automaton of care, her body running on a fuel of sheer will. Her own needs for food, for sleep, for comfort were forgotten, burned away by the singular, all-consuming need to keep him alive. Her care for him was not a chore. It became a sacred rite, a ritual of devotion. Every cloth that wiped his brow, every drop of water she managed to coax between his cracked lips, was an offering. On the third night, the fever broke. She was dozing in her chair, her head lolling forward, when a change in his breathing woke her. The ragged, shallow gasps had deepened, evening out into a slow, steady rhythm. She placed a hand on his forehead. The fire was gone. His skin was still warm, but it was the warm, damp skin of a living man, not the dry heat of a fever. Relief so profound it was physically painful washed through her, leaving her weak and trembling. She laid her head on the edge of his cot and wept, silent, shoulder-shaking sobs of pure, unadulterated gratitude. He began to surface slowly after that, like a swimmer rising from the deepest, darkest water. At first, it was just a flicker of his eyelids, then a low groan. The next afternoon, as she was gently wiping his face with a cool cloth, his eyes opened. They were cloudy, unfocused, and they stared blankly at the ceiling for a long moment before they shifted and found her. He blinked, his brow furrowing in a faint, pained confusion. His lips moved, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. "Shh," she whispered, her heart soaring. "Don't try to talk. It's all right. You're all right." From that moment on, her ritual changed. It was no longer a desperate battle against death, but a patient coaxing back to life. She made him thin broths and soups, and feeding him became a new kind of prayer. She would lift his head, supporting it with one hand, and bring the spoon to his lips with the other. At first, he could barely swallow, more of it dribbling down his chin than into his mouth. But she was endlessly patient, murmuring encouragement, praising each small success. When he was not sleeping, the silence in the room was immense. To fill it, to keep him anchored to the living world, she began to read to him. There were few books in the cabin, a worn Bible, a tattered copy of Shakespeare's plays, and a few farmers' almanacs. She read from all of them. Her voice, soft and steady, filled the quiet space, a constant, living presence. She read of psalms and sonnets, of planting times and weather patterns. She didn't know if he was listening, if he understood, but she felt it was important to fill the silence with her voice, to tether him to the world with a thread of sound. He still did not speak. His eyes would follow her as she moved about the cabin, a quiet, watchful gaze that was slowly losing its clouded confusion and regaining its familiar intensity. But he remained locked in a profound silence, a prisoner of his own injury. One night, a week after the attack, a storm rolled into the valley. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled around the corners of the cabin like a mournful beast. Clara couldn't sleep. She sat by his cot, watching him in the flickering lamplight, listening to the storm inside and out. His hand lay on top of the blanket, still and pale, on impulse. She reached out and took it, her small hand enveloping his larger one. His skin was cool, his fingers limp. She held it for her own comfort, a small point of contact in the lonely, storm-tossed night. She must have dozed off, her head resting on her arms on the edge of the cot. She was dreaming, a chaotic swirl of fear and falling, when a faint pressure on her hand pulled her back to the surface. She lifted her head, blinking. She looked down. His fingers, which had been so limp, had curled around hers. The pressure was weak, but it was unmistakable. It was intentional. Her breath hitched. She looked at his face. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was deep and even. He seemed to be asleep, but the pressure on her hand remained, a faint but steady grip. It was a single, simple gesture, but it was more eloquent than 1,000 words. It was an answer to her pleas, to her care, to her vigil. It said, "I am here. I know you are here. Thank you." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but this time it was not a tear of sorrow or fear. It was a tear of pure, quiet joy. The storm outside raged on, but inside the small, lamp-lit cabin, the world was calm. He was going to live. He had held her hand, and for now, that was enough. It was everything. Recovery, like the slow greening of the valley after a long winter, was a quiet, incremental process. Wade's strength returned not in a sudden flood, but in a steady, seeping tide. The day he first sat up on his own, the cabin seemed to tilt on its axis, righting itself. The day he took his first unsteady steps from the cot to the chair at the table, leaning heavily on the wall. Clara felt a joy so fierce it was almost painful. The mountain was, slowly, learning to stand again. His silence, which had been the unnerving stillness of a man trapped deep within himself, gradually transformed back into the familiar, watchful quiet she had first known. He began to speak again, his voice raspy and weak at first, then regaining its low, rumbling timbre. The words were, as always, spare. A quiet thank you when she brought him a bowl of soup, a soft bend when the boy would come to his bedside to show him a new carving, but each word was a milestone, a stone laid on the path back to the world. When he was strong enough, Raoul brought Ben back to the cabin. The boy entered with a quiet reverence, his eyes wide as he looked at Wade, who was now sitting in the chair by the fire. Ben didn't run to him. He approached slowly, almost shyly, and simply laid a hand on Wade's arm. Wade covered the small hand with his own large one, and the two of them sat like that for a long time, a silent reunion that spoke more than 1,000 words could. With Ben's return, the rhythm of the cabin found a new, deeper harmony. They were no longer a man and a boy, with a woman who was their guest. They were 3 points of a triangle, each connected, each essential. They were a family, forged not by blood, but by fire and fear and a fierce, unspoken loyalty. Clara's role shifted from that of a desperate nurse to something softer, more integral. She was the heart of the small home, her presence a constant, gentle warmth. She managed the cooking, the mending, the cleaning, but it was no longer a way to earn her keep. It was an act of love. She would hum softly as she kneaded bread, the sound a gentle thread of music woven into the fabric of their quiet days. She saw the change in the way Wade looked at her. Before, his gaze had been watchful, protective. Now, it was something more. He would be sitting by the fire, his hands busy mending a piece of leather tack, but she would feel his eyes on her as she helped Ben with his reading from one of the almanacs. She would look up, and he would quickly look away, but not before she saw the unguarded warmth in his expression, a tenderness that made her heart ache in the most wonderful way. The first time he went outside, he stood on the porch for a long time, leaning against a post, simply breathing the clean valley air. Clara stood in the doorway, watching him. He looked thinner, paler, but the essential strength of him, the deep-rooted stillness, was returning. He turned his head and met her gaze. He didn't smile, but his eyes did. "You did this," he said, his voice quiet. "You brought me back." The simple, direct acknowledgement of what she had done for him was more precious than any flowery praise. "You would have done the same for me," she replied, and she knew it was the truth. As his strength grew, the three of them began to spend the evenings on the porch, watching the sky bleed from blue to orange to a deep, velvety purple. Ben would sit on the steps, whittling, while Wade would lean back in his chair, his long legs stretched out. Finally, at peace, Clara would bring her mending basket, the rhythmic pull of needle and thread a comforting pastime. They rarely spoke during these times, but the silence was a shared blanket, warm and comfortable. It was in these quiet moments that Clara felt the last, deepest roots of her old fear finally wither and die. The fear of being hurt, of being used, had been replaced by a profound sense of belonging. But a new fear, a more delicate and fragile one, had taken its place. It was the fear of her own heart. One evening, the air was exceptionally still, and the sunset was a masterpiece of fire and gold. Ben had wandered down to the creek, his silhouette a small, dark shape against the shimmering water as he skipped stones. Wade and Clara were alone on the porch. He was sitting. She was leaning against the railing, her hands resting on the smooth, weathered wood. He rose from his chair and came to stand beside her. He didn't speak, just stood next to her, their shoulders almost touching. As they watched the last sliver of the sun disappear behind the western mesa, the valley was bathed in a soft, ethereal twilight. His hand came to rest over hers on the railing. It was not a tentative gesture, nor was it possessive. It was a simple, quiet statement of connection. His touch was warm and firm, his calloused palm covering her fingers completely. A shiver, not of fear but of a deep, resonant awareness, ran through her. She didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, a silent acceptance. She turned her head and looked up at him, and in the fading light, she offered him a small, genuine smile. "I used to be so afraid," she said, her voice barely a whisper, not wanting to break the spell of the evening. The confession surprised her. She hadn't known she was going to say it. He looked down at her, his gray eyes soft and serious. "Of them." She shook her head. "Not anymore. I was afraid of making a mistake, afraid of doing it wrong." She looked away, out at the deepening shadows in the valley. "My mother taught me how to keep a house, but she never had time to teach me how to be a wife, how to be with a man. And after what happened with my father, I thought I was broken, that I didn't know how to be what a woman is supposed to be, how to be a mother." The words were a quiet admission of her deepest, most secret insecurity. Wade was silent for a long moment. Then, he gently removed his hand from hers and placed it on her chest, his palm resting flat just above her heart. His touch was a brand, warm and steady. Through the thin fabric of her dress, she could feel the solid, reassuring weight of it, and beneath his hand, the frantic, hopeful beating of her own heart. He leaned in, his voice a low, intimate rumble meant only for her. "There are no mistakes tonight, Clara." His gaze held hers, intense and utterly sincere. "Or tomorrow." His words were a benediction. They were an absolution. They washed away the last vestiges of her fear, the shame, the feeling of being inadequate and broken. He wasn't asking her to be a wife, or a mother, or anything other than what she was. Right here, right now. He was accepting all of her, the frightened girl from the train and the woman who had fought for his life. Tears welled in her eyes, but these were not tears of sorrow. She gave a small, tremulous nod. unable to speak past the lump in her throat. He saw the acceptance in her eyes, the answer she couldn't voice. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't move. She tilted her face up to his. His lips met hers. The kiss was not what she had imagined or feared a kiss would be. There was no bruising force, no demanding pressure. It was impossibly gentle, a soft, hesitant question. It was the brush of his lips against hers, as light and as warm as a mote of golden dust caught in a sunbeam. It tasted of the clean night air and a profound, quiet tenderness. It lasted only a moment, but in that moment, a whole new world was born. When he pulled back, his hand was still over her heart. The twilight had deepened, and the first star of evening was burning brightly over the mesa. The fear was gone, all of it. In its place was a quiet, luminous certainty. This was not a mistake. This was home. The seasons in the valley turned with a quiet, unhurried grace. The fierce heat of summer softened into the golden languor of autumn, and the cottonwood trees along the creek traded their green leaves for cloaks of brilliant yellow. The world outside, with its noise and its dangers, became a half-forgotten dream. The cabin, the creek, and the mesas were the whole of their world. And it was a world that was complete. The kiss on the porch had not been a prelude to a sudden, dramatic change, but rather the quiet unlocking of a door that had already stood waiting. It was an acknowledgement of a truth that had been growing between them, as patient and as certain as the turning of the earth. Their life continued in its simple, steady rhythm, but now it was underscored by a new, gentle music. It was in the small, unspoken moments that this new music was most clearly heard. It was in the way Wade would now meet Clara's eyes across the supper table and hold her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. It was in the way she would brush against him as she passed the fireplace. A fleeting, accidental touch that was no longer accidental at all. It was in the way he would find her on her favorite rock by the creek and simply sit with her, not speaking, just sharing the silence and the sun. They had pieced their lives together from the fragments of what had been broken. The shattered door had been mended, its new planks a slightly different color, a visible scar that told a story of survival. The cabin, once a simple bachelor's refuge, was now filled with the small, soft touches of Clara's presence, a jar of wildflowers on the windowsill, curtains sewn from a clean flour sack, the constant, comforting scent of baking bread. Ben, who had been a solemn, watchful child, began to open like a flower in the sun. The safety and the quiet, steady affection that now filled the cabin unwound the tight knot of old sorrows within him. He began to laugh, a sound that was at first startling in its rarity, then became a cherished part of their days. He would run to Clara with his discoveries, his face bright with excitement, and she would kneel to listen, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love she had never known. He was not the son of her body, but he was, in every way that mattered, the son of her heart. One late afternoon, when the light was thick and golden, the three of them walked to the far end of the valley, to a place they had not yet explored together. They had finished the day's chores, and the walk was a quiet celebration of their shared life. Wade walked between them. His long strides shortened to match theirs. Ben ran ahead, his small legs a blur of motion as he chased grasshoppers that leaped from their path. They came to a place where the valley widened, and a meadow, hidden from the view of the cabin, stretched out before them. It was covered in a thick blanket of the same small, yellow wildflowers Clara had picked on that long-ago day. But here, they were not a single, lonely miracle. They were a multitude, a sea of brilliant gold that swayed gently in the evening breeze. They stopped by the old, leaning fence that marked the edge of the meadow. Ben, with a whoop of pure joy, plunged into the flowers, his small body almost disappearing as he chased a pair of white butterflies that danced just ahead of him. Wade leaned against a fence post, a rare, soft smile touching his lips as he watched the boy. Clara came to stand beside him, her gaze on the field of gold. "I never knew this was here," she said softly. "It only blooms for a few weeks in the fall," Wade replied, his voice a low rumble. "When the days get shorter." He reached out and took her hand. His fingers laced through hers, a comfortable, natural fit. It was a gesture that had become as familiar as breathing, a constant, silent conversation between them. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stood together, watching their son play in a field of sunlight and flowers. The memory of her arrival came back to her, as vivid as if it were yesterday. The terror, the desperation, the grime of the train, the sight of this tall, silent stranger who had been her only hope. She looked at his hand holding hers, at the strong, calloused fingers that had saved her, mended her, and now held her with such gentle care. "That day on the train," she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the vastness of the evening. "I only asked if I could hide under your cloak." He turned his head to look at her, his gray eyes holding a universe of unspoken understanding. She met his gaze, and her heart was so full she felt it might burst. "Now," she whispered, "I just want to stand beside you." He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His words were in his deeds, in the home he had given her, the safety he had fought for, the tenderness he showed her every day. He simply looked at her, and in his eyes she saw everything she would ever need to know. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a promise. It was an answer. It was forever. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles. The golden light of the setting sun bathed the valley in a warm, ethereal glow, turning the dust motes in the air into a shimmering veil. They were no longer two strangers, two broken pieces of lives shattered by the harshness of the world. They had found each other in the darkness and had, with quiet patience and gentle hands, pieced each other back together, creating something new and whole. They had created a family. They had built a home. There were no mistakes. There was no fear. There was only this quiet, unshakable love, as silent as the mesas, as strong as the earth, and as real and as beautiful as a single wildflower blooming on barren stone. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach more listeners, you can also show your support by hitting the hype button. We appreciate you being here.